we're really not.
Dr. Freud would like to understand all these repressed emotions that you're feeling.
My brother's wife is Japanese, but like before they got married, they moved to California together, and Foucault was like, Pablo, I have a question for you that's come up between me and Robert. Can I ask you a question? Because you've also dated Asian women? And I was like, I don't know what this could be, but this sounds like a fucking trap. But what she meant to
Because you also have yellow fever.
I do not. I do not.
This is a terrible way to start the podcast.
Brownish yellow fever.
Honestly, that sounds...
That's
kidding.
also
That's
scatologically... Anyway.
That's the worst form of jaundice I've ever heard.
But the question she asked with that opening was, are you comfortable talking about poop? Like, do you talk about it regularly? When you finish a poop, do you tell people about it, the texture? And I was like, no, that shit's gross. And I was like, do you? And she goes, yes. In my family, it's normal. We talk about poop all the time. And I thought this was an Asian thing. And I was like, but you're Japanese. Do you think this is really all of Asia? And she goes like, in my head it is. But that's why I'm asking
Actually,
you.
yes. In my family, too. And I think in yours, too, right?
I think like my family has a very deep comfort with talking about digestion.
Yes.
I think that extends to, I think my mom, if you get too specific, she'd be like, ew, oh my God, ew. But at the same time, she will worry obsessively about the shits of everybody in the household.
Wow.
So she'll be like, did you have a good, is it okay?
Wow,
Are you
okay.
You
No.
know?
And I think...
No, you could be like... Yeah, you could have a severe condition in my family for weeks, and if you didn't tell anyone about it, no one would know.
See, this is why you have a Japanese toilet.
I have a Japanese toilet because it's comfortable.
No, the latest Japanese toilet can actually detect your poop and the color and the texture.
That reminds me of a story of like basically when the Soviet premier, I think it was Nikita Khrushchev, right?
Had constipation.
Well, I think he had some kind of famous like stomach-related disorder. The CIA set up a special toilet for him, and they captured his poo-poo after he poo-pooed, and then they examined it to see whether his condition was severe enough that he would die soon. And like they were like making plans around that.
So, like, this was one person's dream intelligence job. They're like, I'm going to work for the CIA, but really, I hope I get to analyze leader poop. Like,
like it's
that's
Preferably someone who actually gets sexually turned on by this.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Which is a thing, also.
No, I know that, Adi. I'm just...
Pablo's been through a lot this weekend. Maybe we got to take it a little easy on him.
Yeah, I know.
Just
we don't want to
kidding.
shatter his worldview all at once.
No.
Just kidding.
Unload
Pablo.
on me.
Pablo, you're my number one.
You're
Not
my
number two.
I was going to say, you're my number two.
All right. We're here.
That was a great
Introduction.
episode. Introductions, okay.
Introductions. Okay. All right. I am Sharia, and I am one of the three brown guys.
I am Adi, and I am another one of the three brown guys.
I'm Pablo. I'm the whitest of the three, because I'm half white, but I am one of the three brown guys.
And this is the Three Brown Guys podcast. All right.
You brought a topic.
I brought a topic.
Yes.
The topic was diaspora. And I think we all have a lot of thoughts on diaspora because it's a big part of our identities, being some sort of diaspora of something. And in some of our cases, that's layered.
So
right?
I want to confess and say I think I understand what is meant by diaspora in this context, but I'm not 1,000% sure. So I'm going to venture out what I think of on the word, and you guys can tell me, dude, no.
I agree with Pablo. I think we need to define the word. I think we need to be very Confucian about this.
Okay. Well, all right. Yeah, Pablo, let's hear it.
So okay, when I hear diaspora, what I tend to think of is that you have like national identities or even ethnic identities, but some kind of identity marker. And diaspora is kind of how it spreads out. Like when you blow, a dandelion. Diaspora is kind of like the great dandelion fluff that covers the world of not that thing. So like I am half Latino, and my Latino half is from Guatemala, but I'm not Guatemalan. I'm an American citizen. I was raised here, and I've been to Guatemala a few times, but I'm part of a Guatemalan diaspora. And so to me, diaspora is kind of about that kind of giant dandelion fluff of other Guatemalans around the world and how they relate to Guatemala in this case, even though they are like from there but not from there. is that kind of what's understood of like your relationship to something farther away?
I would say that like my understanding of a diaspora is a little bit more specific in that like I only consider certain cultures or countries having a diaspora. Just because, for example, like there is a reason why we don't call Canada English diaspora, or like, America being like, and Australia being an English diaspora.
Sure. I mean, they have national identities of their own at this point, but like there are British people here who are part of the British diaspora, right?
Yes, but at the same time, for example, when we consider, like, we still think about, like, kind of like Rishi Sunak or like, kind of any of like Indian politicians as part of the Indian diaspora.
Okay.
Or like, so
if we really tried, we could make a hierarchy of which ones overtake others. Like
this feels like it rhymes with the expat versus immigrant.
Yeah. I do think so. Like, kind of like what defines a diaspora versus, say, an emigre or like, a migrant or a refugee. Like, I feel like this is, and
I'm gonna be a brown guy about this. I'm gonna say it's the qualia of being far away from something. It is it's a feeling, not really a condition. Like, it's not like, oh, you must be N years before you go from diaspora to emigre. If you believe you're part of this diaspora and you have some kind of claim to it and you have feelings about it, right, then, and like express those feelings either through your identity or through your speech, then you're part of the diaspora.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
Like,
you don't have like a diaspora
I'm just trying to
know?
say that, like, kind of like, for example, like there are certain things that like we always like words that we associate with certain nationalities. Like, we always talk about like Russian emigre, like, and that stem from like a certain political event. But like we never really talk about Russian diaspora.
Do we talk about Slavic diaspora?
I don't really. I don't think that's a thing. Even when we talk about like the immigrant communities that have come to the United States, like the Midwest has a lot of Scandinavian families that came and settled. Like Texas had a lot of Czech families that came and settled. Ohio had a lot of German families, right? Like there's that's the other half of Pablo's heritage.
Yeah, my other half is my great grandfather was German in Ohio,
and so I think part of like. That like I think actually Germans might be one of the few where people do talk about the German diaspora, because there was sort of a scattering of German people even before truly modern times. There were the Volga Germans, which were a group of Germans brought in, I think, by Catherine the Great, maybe even earlier.
Yes, but again, like I don't necessarily see the word diaspora as being used in that context. Like you would talk about like, kind of German immigrants or like, even Italians, you don't use the word diaspora. I think the only, like, if you want to bring in race, like, and I think this might, I don't know if this is true, 100% true, but like the only other quote unquote white people that you use the term diaspora for is the Jewish diaspora, and which I think that this might be a very biblical term in its origin.
Well, because here's the thing is, whenever you go to like Jersey or something like that, and sorry to cut you off, but like you hear a lot of people are like, oh yeah, man, our families are Italian.
Exactly.
But like, I don't consider them immigrants or emigres at this point because they're third generations in and they love pasta and they talk about their big Italian attitudes, but they don't speak Italian, but they have feelings about being Italian and feelings about Italy and the motherland, which they've never been to. And so I think, I don't know, for me, diaspora is feeling centric, because if someone said they're part of the Italian diaspora, I kind of get it because, well, I don't know. I don't mean to
think
spit
the
it
word
out.
that sometimes a lot of them use is like community.
Okay. So I gave you thank you for this. I still kind of like my definition of like it's about a feeling of identity that is scattered, but I'd love to hear what you guys elaborate more and take your best shot at it. I've given a few already.
I'm gonna be appropriative here and be like, in Chinese they don't say diaspora, they say flower people. It's like the term is Huaren, no?
Yeah, but it's not, Hua is not for flower. Hua is basically Chinese.
That's what you get for knowing as much Chinese as I do. For the record, I'm an Indian man.
And not he's Indonesian, but he's Indonesian Chinese.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. Okay, I thought that was the same Hua. All right, There we go. So I guess like part of the like definition, curiosity, whatever. I think this is something that centralized authorities come up with. And then they're
Ooh.
like, I think this is an idea that like only takes, like really takes root. And you know, I bet you could go and look up whether this is actually the fact, whether you could actually see whether people used to refer to Jewish people as a diaspora before Israel. And if they didn't, that's kind of interesting, right? Because that would support my thesis that like diaspora is something you say when there is like a state that claims to be the like quote unquote true representative of those people.
Yeah, and I think that was the point that I was somewhat alluding to in the beginning when I said that, like, you know, kind of why we don't, like, you know, kind of call like Canada, Australia, or the US like basically being like an English diaspora, like because I feel that like they have like Canadians have developed their own culture and identity that is distinct or recognizably distinct from the UK. And I think that, like, you know, kind of in, say, calling, say, Rishi Sunak or, like, you know, I or maybe like Kamala part of, like, you know, kind of the Indian diaspora, you are kind of, in a way, delegitimizing the presence or, like, the identity and the whatever their achievements in their new place.
It's giving one drop of blood. Depending on who does it, right?
Like, say for example, right? Like even in Southeast Asia,
well,
like
again, for me, if someone said Kamala is part of the Indian diaspora, I would believe that because she has some, again, for my definition, she has some relationship to her Indianness. She has some understanding of it. She has some feelings about it, and she then chooses to perform it or not. But she is partially from this part, and she's away. So again. Maybe I don't know what delegitimized means, and maybe I don't see it in use, but this is just how I understand it.
Because diaspora, I would say, also carries certain kind of claim.
Really? Other than membership, but it is a self-selecting group who gets to claim it.
Well, I mean, it's just that, like, you're not as, say, for example, like, if you're part of, like, if you're an Indian diaspora or Chinese diaspora, you're not as Indian or Chinese as the real deal.
That's my understanding. True is that you were a piece of dandelion fluff, but you were not on the dandelion anymore. You got blown off across the globe. You know what I mean?
But are you then, like, you know, at what point is a part of the dandelion no longer a dandelion?
Well, you're not a part of the fluff anymore. You've just now been whatever you stuck to. I don't know. I mean, but that's why like this is a very famously blurry line. Like and so that's kind of why I call it self-selecting. Is that like. A lot of people, like, again, I present very white, and I was raised in a very Latino household, but there are many people who, for some version or other, will say, you're not really Latino, you're not really Latino, to me or other people. And so I kind of feel like being part of the diaspora is like self-selecting based on what you know about yourself.
But you could, say, for example, claim to be, like, you know, kind of like part of the Latino community, or like other words that you could use that and I think this is back to Saurya's point that, like, you know, kind of diaspora has like a center and the periphery, and, like, you know, kind of, and this is like, and I think why I said that this is politically charged. For example, like in the case of Singapore, right? Like, I mean, you don't call, like, you know, kind of Lee Kuan Yew a Chinese diaspora. You say the Singaporean prime minister.
Sure, but that's why I don't think he would tell the world it's important about me that you know I'm Chinese. He says instead, it's more important and it's more my central like identity that I am Singaporean, and in fact I'm Mr. Singapore.
And I think that, like, there are people who would disagree with you, and in fact, like, I think this was like it caused quite a bit of like diplomatic embarrassment because, like, the Chinese government insisted that they're part of the Chinese diaspora, like. Basically, that is the main part of their identity instead of their being Singaporean.
Oh, I know, but I think that disagreement is like the stuff of life. By that I mean, like, it's like being cool or funny or hot. Is like you somewhat self-select into these identities, and they're somewhat assigned to you. You don't get to say I'm funny. And just that gets to be true. Other people have to assign it to you too. But also, if other people all think you're funny and you don't think you are, it's not. So it's this kind of pull and pull, but push and pull. But like maybe the Chinese claim Lee Kuan Yew, maybe Lee Kuan Yew claims Lee Kuan Yew, maybe he doesn't. Who knows? But like that kind of blurriness is a feature of the word diaspora.
I mean, if Lee Kuan Yew doesn't claim Lee Kuan Yew, he's sort of
schizophrenic.
I don't know. What's he up to? Yeah.
But I mean, he claims himself as Chinese versus Singaporean. You know.
Yeah. But I think these things get even weirder because in English, like, we don't like we use the term Chinese to refer to language, ethnicity, and citizenship, right? And like if you hang out with mainland Chinese people long enough, you'll learn the term mainland, you'll hear the term mainland being used a lot more, right? Just distinguish to be like, oh no, like we are different. Like the ones who are descended from the people who left 100 years ago, we are different. Whether we want it to be the case or not, we just experienced a different story. And yet there is some familiarity. And yet when we go, there is like, like this is the case with, I think, with my in-laws. Like I think on one hand are like, no, like we're Singaporean. And then on the other hand, they're like, can't wait to travel more of China and see more of China's. Oh, I'm glad to hear China's doing well. Like there's still some element of pride. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Part of why I chose this topic is because it is fuzzy. And I think that like I don't think it's like, I actually don't think it's a bad term. Right?
I don't either.
No, I don't. I'm just saying.
I think you're a bad person, but I don't think it's a bad term.
I think I'm a funny person. So now everyone
you're part
has
of the
to
funny
think that.
diaspora now.
Yeah, that's right.
It means you're far away from funny, but you still think.
Oh, fuck off.
I also think that I think the reason why I said that it is a very heavy and kind of term is because it reminded me of the difference between a language and a dialect.
A language is a dialect with an army and a navy,
right? And I think that's why I'm saying that why wouldn't you call Australia an English diaspora? I mean, in fact, I think that a significant portion of their population actually have English heritage, English links, and their culture is also very similar. So
many Argentinians consider themselves European diaspora. They're like, I'm not Argentinian, I'm German, I'm French. They'd rather prefer to think of themselves that way.
But you see what I'm saying? But the word diaspora is not used for these people. And so that's why I'm trying to say that.
Australia is an interesting example, though, because it's they literally still... do they still have the monarch?
Yes.
Okay. So I think when a political tie is still there, it's almost like you need at least a few decades of political separation from the main entity to be diaspora. I think if you're truly under a new political entity for a while, right, and then you somehow reconnect with that thing, then it's I don't know.
On the other hand, fun fact, this is why I think it's weird because also when you said about Chinese, there are just so many different words in Chinese to refer to the things that you were talking about. But the one thing that people agree on both sides, Taiwan will never be referred to as part of the diaspora.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
They're either total strangers or just us, damn it, in denial.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
It's compatriot. It's the
damn.
Are we allowed to laugh at that? I also think it's interesting to use the term so within India, there's definitely I think the term diaspora is used for people who, for example, during partition, lost their home state, right? So it's some people refer to Sindhis within India as migrants, or they refer to them as the diaspora of Sindh, right? And I think it's interesting. I don't know. I don't want to put too much emphasis. At some point, this just becomes splitting hairs about what the word means, which is not what I want to get into. It's more
or just the three of us being I heard it used this way. Well, I heard it used this way.
And I think the much more interesting conversation to me is how is that thing that you were referring to earlier, Pablo, of there's this interbeing where we sometimes get to assert that we are blah, blah, blah. And then if we convince enough people that that's the case, then we are seen as that new thing, right? If I just go around and tell people that I am mother, right? And then people will be I don't know what that is mostly, but I guess, and then it will be acceptable. And I think this is it can be almost turned into a flippant thing about identity, which is if you convince enough people to call you this and you're that. But I think that is somewhat the magic of identity, right? And I think that's what like this whole fuzzy area that I think all three of us inhabit is that our identities are a little bit hard to pin down.
Yeah.
Right? And like we're kind of floating I would say we're like floating in the space between planets, right? Where like there are a lot of people who are just like, no, like I'm just Guatemalan, you know?
Yeah, or I'm just a white American, or
yeah. Like it's just like, no, I'm just an Indian guy. And like for me, like that's not so simple. I don't think Adi for you that's very simple. Pablo, I don't think for you that's very simple. And I think this is, I think it's an invitation to be like, what has that fuzziness enabled us to see? Because I think that's what comes out in our conversations. What has that fuzziness enabled us to like, or how has that fuzziness of our own identity enabled us to like look at the world and be like, well, this seems
I'm going to be negative. What has it blinded us to?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, maybe that, like, what has it deprived us of, right? I feel like that's a very, like, if we wanted to go down a self-pitying angle, there's plenty there,
I don't. I actually like what it allows us to see. And frankly, that's why I love talking to you guys.
Yeah. I don't know. I would say, like, I do think of myself as diaspora, right? And I think that, for like what that means for me very specifically is I will never fully be able to let go of the country of my birth, which is India. But at the same time, I don't hold myself to the same obligation to it that a citizen would, right? Like the involvement and the obligation, not something I hold myself to.
Yeah, it is kind of but one thing I remember, put you on the spot here, is when COVID was hitting India, you really had an emotional reaction to that in a way that I found very inspiring. But you were like, we cannot let India fall. It means too much to me. Yeah. And so even though you're like, I don't have the responsibilities or obligations, I think with the right circumstances, you have been pulled into it in a way that, again, I found it really inspiring and beautiful. But like, it kind of, that moment is somewhat in contrast to what you just said about the kind of freedom this enables you to have too.
I also think that was a moment for me to, I don't know if purge is the right word, but there was a lingering like last goodbye to that set of obligations that I had to do.
Interesting.
And I think that's what that served, Like I think coming to America, being exposed to the level of wealth here, and then not being able to do anything about it, knowing I grew up in a pretty well-off family in India, right? My dad was a government employee, which is already puts us in the pretty high brackets back in 1997. But it felt like, wow, with all the money I earned in the U.S., why was I not able to do anything to give back in any meaningful way? And I think that instance that you're referring to was sort of me finally letting go of that and having a sort of healthier relationship where I don't hold myself up to such a extreme standard of obligation. I actually think that's a very diaspora story. I think many people have this sort of almost mythical idea of how they can go back and be greeted, and there's a little bit of like that, like coming back as a king almost. There's a lot of like.
Dude, I'm in this photo. I do not like it.
So just to be a devil's advocate, like, kind of like based on what you're sharing about like, kind of like your feelings towards India. Like it reminded me of, I think there was a philosopher whose name escaped me, saying that like, kind of if God does not exist, we need to invent it.
Yeah.
And I think that like, kind of in the same way, it's like if India does not exist, then you will need to invent India.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know, I feel like it's almost like a vessel.
Do you think that's something about me as a person? Like I would, no matter what, because of like the essence I was born with, I would need some sort of deep, essential definition of who I am. And if that wasn't India, it was going to be something else.
I don't know if it was something that you were born with. It could just be based on like, kind of like your experience and your lived through experience.
I can believe that. I mean, my understanding of my political anger, I was very politically angry for most of my life, and I still have a lot of things I'm mad at, but I was very loud about it on Twitter for my 20s, and something that kind of occurred to me later was it was a safe place to be upset and tragically sad about things. And I think I would have wanted to feel that anyway, but you can't get on Facebook or social media and ask people to witness, I am so lonely, I am so afraid, I am so terrified. But what you can't
Some of our
say,
friends do this on Twitter anyway.
yeah, many of our friends do this anyway. And so that's why when I see a lot of this content, I'm like, to a lot of people, like, what are you doing other than posting? Not to delegitimize the pain, but to suggest that it's not about those issues, but about a pain you need to express, and you found a way to do it. And I think there's a similar thing with identity and diaspora too, where sometimes I'm kind of like, oh my God. Like, I know people who are like, you know what? A lot of my problems are because society hates people like me. People like, and then they point something, short people, that I'm fat, that I'm black, that I'm white. Society hates white men. Like, they find, I think they have like some kind of internal thing and they look for a vessel. And sometimes diaspora serves as a very important, like a key way that you can throw a lot of feelings you have that you don't know what to, and say, it's because I'm diaspora and no one understands the plight of these people. Or when I go back to my home, which I've been to twice, then they will really understand me. And it's kind of a wish. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's for one, it's a messy experience to be alienated from. Like, it is a messy experience to leave your home, right, and go somewhere else. I think, like, for us, all three of us are not in our home city, right? Like, many people in the world don't even really leave their home city, except for, like, you know, going to
Holiday.
yeah, like,
Well, they go to another city.
yeah.
The one that is a lake. I liked your sister's 23andMe, where it was like, for 60,000 years, your family's been in this region of India. In the last 50, across the world.
It is very funny. And like we tried desperately to look for because like, you know, a lot of Indians have what is it called, the R1A gene, which indicates like Central Asian mixture. And like, we've got none of that. Like, we somehow still digest milk, like, thank goodness, you know. But I still prefer yogurt to milk. I don't love milk, but yeah, like, I just think it is a like alienating experience to leave home, and then like, yeah, you end up with very messy emotions where you're like, oh, now there's something that can never be fixed. Now, if there's anything in my life that even upsets me, you know what? I have an amazing dumping ground to put that, to kind of just add more emotional intensity to. And okay, so I think this leads to, but ironically, if enough of this builds up in the community, then amazing things happen. Okay, sorry.
I just wanted to add, and I think, like, you know, that's maybe the second dimension is, like, you know, kind of the time and space of that diaspora identity. It's like almost like you freeze this idea of like the original place.
Yes.
Like, you know,
Yes.
at a given point in
100%.
time. Like, you know, and then I think that's the reason, because like, even if you still go back to that space, the time part has already passed.
Yeah.
Like, it's,
I mean, Pablo, you joke about your Spanish.
Oh,
right?
yeah. So I was going to point out, I was going to credit the same idea to someone else, but no, I joked that my Spanish, I don't speak Guatemalan Spanish. I speak frozen in time 1970s provincial Guatemalan Spanish, because my mom and her family come from a town called San Juan Ostuncalco, which was a small town. Now it's developed a lot. And no one in Guatemala speaks the way my family does, but that's how I learned to speak. No, the playwright Eduardo Machado, he is a U.S.-based playwright who grew up in Miami, I believe, but he's Cuban. He writes plays about Cuban diaspora, but he has a set of people he calls frozen Cubans. And they are people who, as soon as they immigrated, said, any day now, Castro's going to fall because communism sucks. And then 20 years later, they're still in Cuba being like, any day now, Castro's going to fall because communism sucks. And then 30 years pass, and Castro was alive the whole time. And they just kept saying, any day now, next month, we'll go back, we'll get the plantation back, we'll be fine. But I love the phrase frozen Cubans in the sense that, yeah, I think sometimes you can idealize and freeze this kind of specific image.
yeah. And yeah, it reminded me of like the, Taiwanese/ROC legislative yuan. Like, you know, when Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, he brought with him like all these legislatives, the legislative assembly, the legislative yuan, with all these members that were elected pre-Civil War, and because of the Civil War, they could not have another election, and so they're just basically, say, deputy from like Beijing for life, and they're just like in Taiwan representing a region that no longer is part of their control.
But they kept the title and the job the whole time.
Yeah,
They're
pretty
like,
much.
I mean, this is the government in exile. The government, like, it is interesting to read about governments in exile. Like, I think the Polish government was mostly flown to the UK. And like was in exile for much of World War II.
Jesus.
And like Polish pilots also flew British planes for the RAF. Yeah. So like, there's a lot of these instances of like, actually, wait. Wasn't there also a French government in exile during World War II?
Yeah, the Free French, yes.
Yeah, the Free French, yeah. And so, there's just like, I think governments in exile is such a funny thing.
They got kicked out from London.
Oh, wait.
They got exiled from France and then into London, and then the London people were like, get out of here. Sacre bleu.
That's still a way better French accent than the one we heard last night.
Yeah, that is true.
All credit to Four Alarms and Hug, but they did not nail that French accent.
Yeah.
You were going to say something, sorry, about like when enough people do this, something magical happens.
Okay, I think I'm going to use two examples here, which is like, and I'm using magical here in a somewhat like, it is not magical on a moral spectrum, just like I'm observing that this is a thing that happens. The Irish people and like the IRA was basically enormously supported by Irish Americans, right? And Irish immigrants to America. And I think that like Ireland as a country today would not exist if it wasn't for how much money Irish people earned here, sent back to Ireland, and also how they like bought guns and secured deals to like support the IRA for like 100+ years, right? Maybe it's not 100 years of support totally, but like it's like just the Irish freedom movement was spurred by like this, like these people who left Ireland, and they left objectively bad conditions, right? They were not like chilling in Ireland and were like, I'm going to go off on a mission to America. They were like very much emigrating from Ireland, looking for better economic opportunities. They get to America. And once they get to a better stage, they're like, you know what? Ireland was amazing, you know? And like they actually legitimately like did turn it into like this emerald isle in their imagination. And they're like, we have to fight for it, you know?
Yeah.
We have to fight for it. And it became this like, I don't know. They managed to manifest in a way that I think like all national founding myths need a little bit of fantasy for it to truly succeed, right? And like I think they held on to it. I think there's something similar with the Ukrainian diaspora, right? Where I think like so much of Ukraine's war effort could probably not have like gone forward if it wasn't for Ukrainian Americans, right? And I just think that it's so hard to find the line between fantasy and reality in these things, because sometimes believing in these fantasies does result in very real things happening. And you're like, how the hell did that happen? You know, this is actually even the story of Mongolia as a country. And this is sort of a kind of a tired tale, because it is just like a crazy white dude who shows up. And like at that point, a lot of Mongolia is like, this is like the 1920s or something. Maybe a little bit earlier. I forget exactly the details of the story. But there's like a guy who was like, you know, you guys used to rule the whole world. And like at that point, Mongolia was like not, you know, an organized, like hugely organized political entity. It was just a lot of people who were living their lives and didn't need any form of political unity. And then this dude sort of like kept telling stories of like Genghis Khan and all of that. And people were like, dude, we all know those stories. Like, why are you getting so excited about it? Random foreign dude, like being a weeb here. But he does manage to muster some kind of national spirit. So I don't know. I'm not trying to like say that this is a necessarily good thing. But I think there's a weird power that the fantasies of diaspora have in the world. And it's something I just like cannot.
I don't know if it's necessarily a fantasy. Like, you know, kind of like maybe I'll give you like a much better example of like, you know, a diaspora.
Get his ass. Get his ass.
No judgment
Bring
there.
it.
No tea, no shade.
No tea, no shade, but my example's way better.
Yeah.
And you're wrong.
Let's give me the non-shitty example out of here.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that like, you know, if you talk about like, you know, the 1911
Sucks. No, sorry.
the 1911, like, you know, revolution, like in the Chinese Revolution, like it was totally financed by the Chinese diaspora. And like, kind of Sun Yat-sen went on a world tour, like, and raised money from like Chinese diaspora, especially, I think in Vietnam was, I think when he raised like a significant portion of like, the funding for the revolution. It was, I think something that he recognized that Sun Yat-sen actually codified, like, and I think this is still true in like ROC, that like, kind of like giving people Chinese diaspora legal status in the ROC constitution.
Interesting.
Because of the financial contributions that they made.
It's Patreon rewards. Fund a revolution for $300 and above. You get citizenship.
I mean, it is fascinating
in the new state.
It is fascinating to think about how many national projects are actually like international in support. Like, I don't know. There's
Well, they kind of have to be to get recognized, right? Like, you must have some form of international support in order to, like, for other countries to have some constituency that also believes this.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think it's just that sometimes the story is so, and I don't know.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I think it's the same thing with Gandhi also fundraised quite a bit like internationally.
Yeah, and he wasn't even the first Indian, like his wasn't even the first Indian movement to do that. There was the Ghadar rebellion, Ghadar mutiny earlier in the 1920s, 1910s. And that involved people here in California.
And
right?
you forgot that, like, the Bolshevik Revolution was financed by the Germans.
That's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, that for the low price of one train ticket for one cat lover, you can topple the entire Russian government.
Small domino, big domino. Well, the thing about like people in Ireland leaving a bad time and then coming back, but somehow retconning it into something beautiful.
I don't know about the coming back part.
Well, not coming back part, but like we're retconning it as an idea of like that beautiful green island that we all left, right? And they forget the story of it. Like, it reminds me of a favorite comic about two millennials, an elder millennial and a younger millennial, fighting over which Zelda game is the best. And they're both yelling at each other, and they're both fighting. They're both wearing Triforce t-shirts. But one of them goes like, the Zelda game that was the best was, and in parentheses, the one that came out when I was 12. And the other guy goes, no, it's the one that came out when I was 12.
Yeah.
And I just think the passage of time creates nostalgia for people. Like, they're probably like, oh man, the hunger was bad, but I was a boy. And I got to play. And now I have like obligations I don't like. And like the material conditions got a lot better. But on some hand, there's just kind of like, but I was younger. My body wasn't sagging. Like, So I wonder how much that has to go into this kind of retconning idealizations, the fact that just the forward passage of time, people get more jaded and they miss their less jaded selves.
And this is not to call out the Irish in any particular way, but some of it is also, I think, racism.
Oh, yeah.
Right? People came I think the Irish in particular came to America. They experienced a fair amount of bias towards themselves. And they also ran into all these odd other people. Yeah. And they're like, what? We don't have this in Ireland.
Worst of both worlds.
Yeah.
I have to deal with other people and I'm treated like some other person.
Yeah. And this is shit.
This is shit in both ways.
But I think that there's an element of, at least in some national stories, there's like somebody who goes out there in the world and is like, oh, that's terrifying. We have to make a safe haven, and then coming back to kind of like do that. I'm not going to say that like this is not a now we list the countries, but it's like there's definitely a feeling of like nationalism is a cousin to a sort of like inability to work in pluralism, right? For a lot of people, and like I think we romanticize nationalists who might actually have very anti-pluralist origins, but if they're like fighting an imperial power, we're like, oh, those are the good guys. They're fighting for their country. They're fighting against the mean empire, right?
Do you mean we as a human collective, or we in this room? Because I definitely love pluralism more than like anything. And if someone fights on behalf of a country or a national identity at the exclusion of others, I don't know.
I think that the problem with pluralism is that like, kind of like it could very well like lead into like to like a majoritarian authoritarian or oppressive state.
Yeah.
And like
I'm saying I like the idea of pluralism. I'm not saying it's implemented particularly perfectly.
Well, but I'm just saying that, like, if let's say 51% of the country vote to oppress the other 49%,
yeah, what just happened?
We're not doing another election.
Yeah, we are
podcast
not.
episode.
But I agree with you that I accept the risk, but I still think it's the best thing we've got than like say mono states or like
No.
mono-identity states.
I'm not discounting that. Like, kind of like I'm not for nation state, and I agree that, like, I am for pluralistic government. I'm just saying that, like, this. I guess to Sarya's point that, like, the same ingredients, like, it's just an overbaked souffle or whatever. Like, kind of like it's very easy to, like, switch from one mode to another, and like and I think that, like, it could lead to, like, an irreversible change, and this is the part that, like,
Is there such a thing as an irreversible change?
well, maybe. I mean, they did say that you could technically unboil an egg, but, like,
Is that true?
But I'm talking about like
Is that only in space?
Yeah,
I don't know. So it's like
Also, I don't
supposedly you
think-
can disentangle, like,
chaos
the
theory is
protein.
real,
Yeah.
but I mean, like, actually in geopolitics, everything that's ever been true has changed or could change. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, my point is that, like, kind of like, why did, like, Central American Republic, like, splintered, or like Gran Colombia, like, I mean,
I'm not saying what you're describing doesn't happen. I'm just being pedantic about the phrase irreversible change because it may have splintered. It could come back.
No, of course.
I think I kind of get what both of you are talking about, and I'm going to use that as an opportunity to make my point more clear.
with your inferior examples.
Well, I'm just glad because I lost what we were talking about.
Yeah,
I just
me
felt like
neither.
fighting him. So
Yeah, I was
anyway,
like, I'm
No,
sorry.
I think my point is that, like, we love people who fight against a big bad empire.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And, like, I think we like, as a culture, I think in America we love that.
Yeah,
like
go
Star
Taliban.
Wars. Sorry.
yeah, go Taliban.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, we're huge fans of the Taliban as long as they're, like, wielding lightsabers, right?
Yeah, exactly. No,
but-
typically we like underdogs. Yeah.
Yeah, but, like, we like the underdogs, we like them, but then I think that, like, once that fight is over and the underdogs have won, oftentimes the underdogs are kind of the bad guys.
The Taliban. Which, to be clear, I've never supported the Taliban. They fucking suck ass. But what I mean to say is that, to me, it's really funny that they view themselves as the Rebel Alliance, and we really are the empire that they are fighting.
Yeah.
The truth is, though, if you subjugate your women that way, go fuck yourself. But it's, to your point, yeah, sometimes the little scrappy guys win, and we're like, yay! And then we see what they put in their place, and we're like, oh, no.
And I think it's like, I would say, I would generalize this to a rule that, like, nationalists are really useful as a counter to imperialists, right? And I think both give, they're both like, I don't know, I don't have a perfect metaphor on hand for this right now, but it's like, you don't want either of them to dominate the mix because it just leads to bad outcomes. But if you find the right balancing act between the two of those, you get the pluralism of the imperialists, right? With the, like, actual, like, efficiencies and sovereignties and, like, safety of nationalists.
So I love pluralism at a nation state level. You're zooming out and saying you like pluralism on a pluralism or not angle. Like, you want the perfect mix where you get some pluralism and through the empires and some,
Yeah.
I think that's a cool point.
I guess I don't know. Would that be federalism?
I guess, yeah. Like, I think there was one of the earlier proposals of how to break up India was to make what is now Pakistan an autonomous region, right? So it would still be like one giant military and all of that, but, like, Muslims would have an autonomous region in what is modern day Pakistan, what is modern day Bangladesh.
Clearly irreversible and irrevocable. Just kidding.
Apparently, you never say never in geopolitics. You know, there are still people who talk about reunion in Indian politics, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, for
okay.
sure.
Actually, you know what? Back to the topic of diaspora. Do you ever consider them part of your diaspora?
Who's them? There is no them. They're just us.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
No, I don't think that. I don't think it's as cleanly a diaspora situation. But there are very clearly people. So within Pakistan, I think they call the group of the sort of the Indian Muslims who came over specifically from North India, from Lucknow and Aligarh and a bunch of the the old Mughal cities. They're called Mehmani, like in Pakistan itself. And I think they consider themselves to be diaspora, right? Like I think they're like, oh, our true, like they have a kind of complex relationship. I think from what I've read of like they have a complex relationship with Pakistan as a country because they see themselves, the Mehmani see themselves as the bringers of Muslim high culture, because that was their tradition back in India. But they didn't believe that they could continue doing it in India. So they were like, we're going to do it in Pakistan. And then they show up and it's like, wait, we're like the head of a different body, like now here, right? Like there's not like the industry that's required to support that form of Muslim high culture didn't exist in Pakistan when these people showed up. So they were hella confused. Mm. And so there are definitely, again, getting back to this point, there's diasporas within this continent. And like, I don't know, there's so many fascinating stories like that because there are these families that you see like the same name kind of repeated over and over. For example, Qureshi is a very like famous name because Muhammad himself was a Quraysh, which is like a tribe. And so Qureshi means like, oh, you're like descended from the same tribe as Muhammad, right? And Islam is mostly anti-caste, anti-hierarchy in a lot of ways, right? But as doctrinally, right? And like,
Adi, you can say things out loud so people can hear. Adi looks like he ate.
No. Please continue. I have no idea what you're talking about.
But I think there's one sort of written down rule, which is that the caliph has to be a Quraysh, right? So that's one of the I believe so.
I mean, the Ottoman sultans called themselves a caliph.
The Ottomans are they're whatever.
A diaspora?
Yeah, the Ottomans are Mongolian diaspora.
Maybe we need a fourth brown guy.
But no, I think that like if you look in the history of South Asia, you'll see like some names pop up a bunch. Right, Qureshi is one of them. Changezi is another one. Changezi is Chinggis, so descended from Chinggis Khan. And then Pirzada is another one. Pirzadas are like a famous family, or no, maybe not family, like group of merchants and artists and all of that had huge cultural impact. So I don't know. I think there's just something very interesting about viewing the world in this way too, of like networks of influence. Right? Not like, here's what people in this one geographic region did, but like these people scattered, and as they scattered, something about the formula they brought to all these places kind of hit. And isn't that interesting? Or you could say...
Dandelion seeds.
Yeah.
They made more dandelions.
And I think, kind of like, maybe to tie back, kind of like to what our first point of discussion is that, I'm not trying to deny, I think my problem was with the terminology of what is considered a diaspora, and but other than that, I do think that, for example, kind of this dispersal. I'm trying to use words that are less
dandelion
loaded.
words. Yeah, you get it. Yeah.
More flowery metaphors, please.
Yes, dispersal. People, I think has an impact on the new place, and I think it also has a feedback on the to the old country, and I think as we saw in the examples of China, Ireland, and I completely forgot. I think another example is for example. How Indian diaspora and Chinese diaspora have both contributed significantly to the development of India and China economically in the modern time.
I don't know if you'd use diaspora for Guatemalans or Central Americans generally, but entire neighborhoods in Central America are built on remittance dollars, on people sending money home. It is I think one of the biggest economic drivers is just foreigners sending money home, or foreign nationals sending money home.
I mean, this is also the story. There's a very compelling story to be made that Europe's development was also because of Europeans emigrating to America and sending money back
home.
to Europe. Right?
It's true.
Well, and I think that's why there is some kind of form of legal recognition of status. The OCI card, overseas citizens of India, like, in acknowledgement to their contribution to like India, or like the fact that like I think most European countries still like allow kids to get grandfathered, and like and so I think it definitely has an impact, and I think it's also true, like, kind of like I think the presence, like the dispersal of like these communities and like, people enrich the new countries that they're in. It's just that my problem is with the terminology of like diaspora, just because I feel like it kind of
unevenly applied.
Yeah, and also underplayed that contribution. Like I want to say that, like, kind of on both sides. Like I mean, like, kind of like.
Oh, in some ways, like there's an implication in diaspora of like, oh, the mother country gave you so much, and now you have been cast to the wind to give your fruits to some other country. And there's maybe a little bit of an implication of that in it. Do you is that?
Yeah. And the thing is that like you don't recognize that, like, in some ways they are also shaping, like, for example, like how other countries perceive your country, or like kind of how they contributed to the cultural and economic development of their mother country.
Yeah, it's so hard to enumerate all these things, right? And I think that's what's so fascinating to me about this topic of just like it is. It's almost like the central tension of being diaspora is like, does anybody see us? Does anybody see all of us? Like, and it's like the mother country doesn't. The new host country doesn't. Do we each other as diasporas, like, do we see each other? Or do we just know that like we are in this dimension that we're in? We know there are other hyperdimensional travelers around us, but we can't really like see them either.
Well, it's funny because
purgatory.
Purgatory.
Well, I mean, you talked about like, you're getting a healthier relationship to what your relationship should be to India through the COVID thing as a very diaspora experience. For me, it's like, who sees you and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, you're like, oh my God, does anyone see this? There are other travelers, because the home country doesn't, the new country doesn't. I don't meet many other half Guatemalans. And honestly, when I do, I'm like, oh, you might have even come from a different part of Guatemala, or you were frozen in time at a different decade than my parents were.
Yeah.
It's hard even for people of like, however like you have to get real specific. And I think part of the diaspora experience for me, if I can say that I have that, is how there's just not another you, like there are maybe some things like you, but you just have to live with the fact that there aren't. And
I think at some point it becomes, and I think this is a very, like in America, it's just like immigrant is an ethnic group.
Yeah.
Where just like all immigrants are like, oh yeah, we came here and the first thing we did was we would wash our plastic cutlery and then like reuse
it's
them.
It's like the whole food aisle.
Yeah. Look, there was a time where Whole Foods didn't exist, like where ethnic foods, like ethnic foods didn't exist. Like it was like sauerkraut was what was in the ethnic foods aisle, right?
But it's funny because, another thing that I observed in like the mid 2000s when I was in high school is My Big Fat Greek Wedding came out, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody who was not a white monolingual American who's been here for 3 generations, anybody who was like one generation away, no matter where they came from, said, oh my God, that's my family.
Yeah.
But especially non-Greeks. Like every Latino family was like, oh my God, that's my family. Every Italian family was like, oh my God, that's just like us. And it was just like big,
awful
loud
Italian accent, by the way, but that's fine.
That was just meant to be not me.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's a me. No,
you can't do all accents.
we're cutting this in
Apparently
post.
only French.
We're making this even more racist in post.
Someone has to do this. It's going to be the whitest one of us. But like, everybody was like, my family is so much bigger and louder than white Protestantism, and thank God there's something I can call representation, even though it was Greek, and I don't know many Greek people. And I just thought that was a funny way of being like, we're all diaspora somewhere else, and the closest we can find to...
It's like parallax effect, right? You're here on Earth, so like 2 stars that are like billions of light years away from each other look right next to each other because you're looking from here on Earth, right?
Yeah.
So I think from the vantage point of white Protestantism, a lot of cultures look very similar.
Yeah.
Right? But I think that's partially because, and there's a very interesting book about this, which is like, or I shouldn't say very interesting. Dora fell asleep reading this book. Dora's my wife. But it was called Weird. It was just like Western, educated, individualistic, something democratic. It's like basically saying that actually that the way Westerners live is the weird way of living, right? Mm-hmm. Like most people in the world do not live this way. Just like it's not really. It's an interesting starting point to start from, and then look back at a bunch of cultures, right? But you're 100% right that there's something there too, because like my dad saw the dancing in my big fat Greek wedding, and was like, "Oh, those people are Punjabi."
Yeah.
Right? He's like, my dad's like, I lived in Delhi. Those people are Punjabi. They think they're Greek. They're Punjabi.
Yeah.
And my family's not Punjabi, but my dad was very much like, that's the dance they do. You know, that's what it is.
I don't know. Maybe from my side, like I want, like I think, like based from what you're saying, like the way I perceived it is that instead of like. I don't know. Like, I think that, like, we talk about, like, kind of WASP or, like, white Anglo-Saxon, like, Protestants as, like, or white Protestants as, like, this, like, single entity. But I kind of see it as more as to, like, it's an amalgamation of, like, different identities that have made it to the quote-unquote mainstream core or of power, in the sense that, like, because when we talk about, like, kind of white Protestants, right, like if you say, for example, examine, like, other countries, like maybe like South Africa, like you will see that, like, that is a big split between, like, the English, the Anglophones, and, like, kind of like the Afrikaners, and I think, like, even
they even went to war, didn't they? Wasn't there a whole ass war between the Boers?
The Boer Wars?
Yeah.
But, and I think, like, I think about, like, kind of like even like within white Protestants, right? Like I see the distinctions between, like, say Lutheranism from, like, Presbyterianism from, like, Anglicans or Episcopalians, like as distinct enough for me to kind of like notice, like, even though that, like, and I don't know, like, and I think this is where it's kind of like shifting in the way that, like,
but even the sensitivity and nuance with which you're willing to make that distinction is, like, kind of like, it's amazing, right? Because you have this, it's like you have the fine, like the, on your fingers, you can tell, like, very small bumps on the surface. Like you're saying, like, even within this supposedly monolithic group, there are, like, breakups. And I think that's partially to your credit. Like, this is, I think, some of the power of being multi-identity, multi-diaspora. It's diaspora.
But also, like, I think to me, it's the point that, like, kind of the center itself is dynamic.
I mean, of course.
And it's something that, like, kind of that is constructed in relation to the other. And, like, kind of like basically what would be different in another place would be considered the same here, because, like, you have a different other, and maybe, like, throughout decades or, like, different, like, political administration, it evolved.
No, I think if all the other were to get removed, or, like, most of it, suppose they lost their share by half, and then we had twice as many like what I call white Protestants, I'm sure they would start picking at those bumps really hard to create new majorities within them. Like, I'm sure they would just also like really exaggerate those bumps. I think it's kind of a human nature thing to be like, oh, who's in the room with me? And then you group some, but then as it gets more homogenous, you kind of heterogenize your worldview to make more others if you don't have one.
I feel like when my family first came to Yorktown, Virginia, they were like, we didn't see any other, like, people with melanin. And so my mom was in the grocery store, and this woman comes up to her and just hugs her. And this woman is from Lahore in Pakistan. And then for the next month and a half, and this is, like, within 3 days of us arriving in the U.S. So we were like, what is happening in this country? There's nobody who looks like us. And this lady comes and she hugs my mom and, like, starts speaking to her in Hindi. And then they're like, my mom and her hit it off. And for the next month and a half, we are playing with, I'm playing with her kids, and, like, we're all getting along. And then that lady finds like other Pakistani families around, and then my family finds other Indian families around, and then we slowly start, like,
drifting.
Like, we slowly start drifting, right? It's just, like, becomes, like, a little bit less, like, there was never a desire to be like, we didn't have an official partition. This family and us, like, we're just like, but we did just kind of split. So I don't know. I think it's just a very funny, like, as funny as partition gets, that's as funny as it gets. Like this is how it goes. Okay, so I would love for us to do a little closing ritual, closing statement, if I could encourage that.
Let's go.
All right. We're not great at picking topics for next time, but instead of picking topics, I'm going to say, let's just each of us say one thing about our current topic that you actually think there's like a whole world like we could go into in that. I'll kick us off.
Kick it off.
Because I'm like, I might be hungry at this moment, but I think some of the most interesting things that happen is when Diaspora encounters new like material realities, but still wants to make food taste good. And I think a lot of good stuff comes out of that. And look, I was a pretty racist kid when I was younger. Like I did not like if somebody put naan on the same plate as like sambar, right? Naan is North Indian and sambar is South Indian. I would get very upset. I'd be like, no, those do not belong together. And my parents are like, where the fuck did this kid get this? Like who taught him, who's teaching him these things, right? And if somebody put ketchup next to dosa, I would lose my shit, right? My dad is not like this. My dad is very open-minded. And he's like, he will combine any foods, right? And I don't think this is because he had to leave home early and go other places. And he just adapted to like whatever was around. He's like, whatever tastes good, eat it, enjoy it, right? So this is my thing. I think there's a whole world of how when people leave home and they try to get that taste of home again, magic happens. And I think that's like we could spend a whole episode talking about that and getting very hungry.
Okay, I've got one. I've got something we can zoom into if we want to. Relationship of people and their diasporic identities and language in terms of like whether or not how you carry it, how you mutate it, whether it matters or not for you to pass it on to your children or not. Ooh. So I know that, like, for example, it was important for my family that we all grow up speaking Spanish. I grew up with my grandparents who only speak Spanish and allowed me to communicate with them. But how good our Spanish was, how correct it was, versus how white we present, versus I have other cousins who are a lot more like visibly Latino for what Americans consider Latinos to look like, versus when I meet other Latinos who say like, oh, I was never taught Spanish. And they sometimes, I would argue, have some insecurity about it. Others don't. But then sometimes I find feelings within myself when I meet people who do or don't. I just think all of that is like language, how I feel about when I want to have kids and how important it's going to be and why. Love it. I don't know. I think we can zoom into that and have a lot of conversations and express some feelings.
Love it.
I think my take on that is like very much similar to you, Saria, like in the sense that, like, because like I cook a lot, like, kind of like food is one of my passions, and I feel that like it's something that's important, and I think that there's something that like a lot of people forget, like that different cuisines, different food are a result of dynamic mixing, in a sense that, like, I mean, we cannot think about like Indian or Italian cuisines without tomatoes, which were not even there a couple of centuries ago, or chili pepper, and like, and the same thing, like, for example, how like much of like, the repertoire of like French cuisine was brought by Catherine de Medici from Italy, and like, kind of like much of German cuisine was brought by French Huguenots, and I think you can still see traces of it today, and like even like in Asia, like, kind of like I still find it that, like, in Indonesia, for example, the word for noodles came from like a Fujianese word for noodles, and kind of like, and it's just so. Like Indomie, for example, like probably the most famous Indonesian export, mee itself was the Fujianese word for noodles, and it's not.
So in Vietnamese.
Yeah, and it's not something that is like we pay attention to today, because I think our the current geopolitical system tend to emphasize differences, like or immortalize the differences between these cuisines.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that like in reality things have always been more fluid, and like I think this is just a snapshot of the time that we're living in.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, my fellow brown guys.
Thank you, my fellow brown guys.
Thank you, my fellow brown guys. I hate that. I hate that. I really hate that.
All right. No, thank you, my fellow brown guys. Thank you for listening to the Fellow Brown Guys podcast.
Do not thank the king.
Do not thank the king. You'd have to go to a show to get that one. All right.